My name is Laura, and for 15 years, I thought being a good wife meant keeping everything together. I cooked, cleaned, smiled through the silence, and told myself this was love. Then one night my husband looked me in the eye and said I was just a boring housewife. He didn't know that sentence would change everything. Because that night, I decided he was about to learn what losing me really looked like, and when it finally happened, he would wish he had never said those words. The next morning felt like any other, but something inside me had shifted. I moved through my usual routine, folding laundry and preparing breakfast, but everything felt heavier. Mark scrolled through his phone while eating, barely saying a word. I watched him, realizing I had spent years catering to a man who no longer even saw me. It wasn't anger that I felt at first, just a deep, hollow ache. That ache told me something simple and clear. I had disappeared somewhere in my own marriage, and I wanted to find myself again. As I packed Mark's lunch, I noticed how robotic my movements had become. Sandwich, chips, napkin, lid, same every day. My hands worked, but my mind drifted somewhere else. I wondered when I had stopped laughing. When had my life turned into routines instead of choices? I tried to remember the last time Mark looked at me with warmth, and I couldn't. He grabbed his lunch, mumbled a thank you, and left. The door shut softly behind him, and for the first time I stood still long enough to notice how quiet my life really was. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my reflection in the stainless steel toaster. The woman looking back seemed tired, drained of color. I used to love mornings, used to paint before breakfast when I was younger. I'd wanted to be a designer, to fill rooms with life and light. Somewhere along the way, that version of me had faded behind grocery lists and laundry baskets. The clock ticked loud, almost mocking me. I felt like I'd been living the same day on repeat, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could stand it. Later that day, I went grocery shopping like always, walking the same aisles I knew by heart. Everything felt so predictable, the same songs, the same faces, the same tired small talk. I saw two women laughing near the produce section, carefree, dressed in bright colors. For a second, I envied them. They looked like they had stories, like their lives still had movement. I caught my reflection in the glass door of the freezer and barely recognized myself. My world had become so small that it barely seemed worth living inside anymore. When Mark came home that night, I hoped he'd notice something different, maybe ask how I was feeling. But he just turned on the TV, ate dinner in silence, and scrolled through his messages. I watched him, waiting for some flicker of connection. But there was nothing. We were two strangers sharing walls and bills. I realized that I'd been holding on to a version of us that no longer existed. The man who once promised partnership had become a roommate who barely looked at me. That truth hurt, in a way I couldn't explain. Later that evening, I passed by his office door and heard him on the phone with one of his coworkers. He laughed loudly and joked about his boring housewife. The words sank deep, like they had weight. I stood there frozen for a few seconds, listening to the sound of his laughter. I had always known he took me for granted, but hearing him mock me confirmed everything. I walked away quietly, feeling both humiliated and strangely clear-minded. The fog that had covered my thoughts for years started to lift in that single moment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought about who I used to be. There was a time when I dreamed of designing homes, maybe opening a small studio. I had ideas, ambition, life, but I traded all that for comfort, for safety, for the illusion of love. The house felt like a cage now, each room filled with memories that didn't feel like mine anymore. I realized that Mark's words hadn't created the emptiness. They had only named it. I was already gone. I just hadn't noticed until now. The next morning, I made breakfast again, but this time I didn't hurry. I took my time, watching the sunlight hit the counter. I wondered how something so ordinary could feel new when I finally paid attention. Mark complained about traffic and deadlines. I listened, but I didn't respond. When he left, he didn't notice I hadn't kissed him goodbye. That tiny moment felt powerful. It wasn't rebellion, it was clarity. For the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped by routine. I felt quietly aware of how much control I had given away. After cleaning up, I started searching through an old drawer looking for a notepad. Instead, I found a dusty sketchbook from my 20s. The cover was bent, the pages yellowed, but inside were drawings I had forgotten, colorful room designs, furniture layouts, patterns I once loved. It felt like finding a version of myself buried under years of silence. I flipped through the pages slowly, smiling at old dreams that still felt alive. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and began sketching again, my hands shaky but my heart awake. That small act filled me with a quiet energy I hadn't felt in years. I stayed up drawing until the light outside faded. The designs weren't perfect, but they were mine. When Mark came home, he barely glanced at the papers spread across the table. He complained about the cold dinner, then turned on the TV. I didn't argue. I just watched him and realized how far apart we'd grown. For years, I tried to keep us close by shrinking myself. Now I was ready to grow, even if it meant growing away from him. The next morning, I decided to share my excitement. I told Mark I wanted to start a small design business, maybe from home. He laughed like I'd told a joke. He said I wouldn't last a week, that I didn't understand the real world anymore. I smiled, pretending not to care, but inside I felt something snap. It wasn't anger, it was a clean break. I realized I had been waiting for his permission to live my own life. I didn't need it anymore. That was the moment I decided to stop asking and start doing. Later that day, I went for a walk. The sky was gray and the pavement still wet from the morning rain. The air smelled fresh, sharp, alive. Every step made me feel lighter, as if each one took me further from the person I'd been. I thought about how much of my life had been spent waiting for someone to notice, to appreciate, to love me right. But walking alone, I realized I didn't need to be chosen. I could choose myself. The thought scared me, but it also made me feel completely free. As I turned a corner, I heard a church bell ring from down the street. The sound carried softly through the air, deep and steady. For some reason, it felt like it was calling me, reminding me of time passing. I stopped walking and listened until the echo faded. In that quiet, I promised myself I wouldn't waste another year living small. I was done disappearing. I was done apologizing for wanting more. Whatever came next, it would be mine. And for the first time in years, I actually believed that. On the way home, I passed a small art supply shop I hadn't noticed before. The windows were dusty, but behind the glass were brushes, paints, and sketchbooks. I felt drawn to it. I checked the hours and saw it open tomorrow. I smiled and made a mental note to come back. When I reached home, the lights were off, and Mark's car wasn't in the driveway. The quiet felt peaceful instead of lonely. I sat down on the couch, looked around, and thought this house might not be my prison anymore. When Mark returned, he asked why dinner wasn't ready. His tone was impatient, almost annoyed. I didn't explain. I just watched him as he opened the fridge and sighed loudly. Then I noticed a cake box in the corner, the birthday cake I had bought for him 2 weeks ago and forgotten. I opened it, stared at the untouched frosting, then quietly threw it away. That small act felt final. It wasn't about the cake, it was about everything. I had spent years celebrating a man who stopped celebrating me. That ended tonight. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again, flipping through my old sketches. I noticed how each design carried a bit of my personality: bright colors, open spaces, soft edges. They were full of life, the complete opposite of how my home felt now. I realized my surroundings had started to mirror my marriage, dull and muted. I wanted to fill my world with color again. The thought felt bold, but also right. I looked at my hands, stained faintly with pencil smudges, and whispered to myself that it was time to start over. The next morning, I checked the clock. Mark would leave for work in 10 minutes. I made coffee, but didn't bother preparing his lunch. He frowned when he noticed, but I didn't explain. After he left, I sat down at my computer and searched for online interior design courses. My heart raced as I entered my name into the form. It felt strange, like doing something forbidden, but when I hit enroll, I smiled. It wasn't just a class, it was a doorway. A small step toward the woman I used to be, and the one I was becoming. The lessons started that evening. I felt nervous logging in, surrounded by strangers on my screen, but they all shared the same spark I'd been missing. The instructor's voice reminded me that creativity didn't fade, it just waited. I took notes, practiced designs, and stayed up long after Mark went to bed. The house was quiet, except for the tapping of my keyboard. For the first time in years, I wasn't dreading the next day. I was building something new, one small decision at a time, and it felt like breathing fresh air after being underwater. Days turned into weeks, and my evenings became my own. I worked, studied, and drew late into the night. Mark started noticing the difference. He'd come home to find dinner late or cold, and he didn't like it. He asked why I was wasting time on little hobbies. I didn't answer. The silence between us grew louder, but instead of feeling guilty, I felt lighter. Each sketch I finished gave me something I hadn't felt in years: self-worth. I realized I didn't need his approval. The person I needed to impress was the one I saw in the mirror. One evening, while sketching a living room design, the power went out. The house sank into darkness. Mark cursed from the living room, complaining about the outage. I found a candle and lit it, the soft glow spilling across my sketches. It looked beautiful, warm, alive. Mark grumbled while I sat quietly, tracing lines on paper, feeling peaceful. Without electricity, there was no noise, no television, no distractions. For the first time, I felt present. It struck me how calm life could be when I wasn't trying to fix everything for someone else. When the lights came back, I looked around the room and saw the mess I had been too tired to notice for years: half-folded laundry, unopened mail, cold food. My home reflected the exhaustion I carried. I decided I wouldn't live in a place that drained me anymore. That weekend, I rearranged furniture, threw out clutter, and painted the dining room wall a soft shade of green. Mark walked in, surprised, and asked what got into me. I just smiled and said I wanted a change. He didn't know this was only the beginning. As my confidence grew, I joined a small online group for women learning design. We shared projects and encouraged each other. I met others who had been told the same things I'd heard all my life: that their dreams were silly, that they were too old, too late. But together, we proved otherwise. Their stories pushed me forward. Every message, every compliment reminded me that I wasn't alone. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I felt connected, like I belonged to something bigger than just my kitchen walls. One day, one of the women in the group messaged me. She said my work had potential and encouraged me to post my designs online. I hesitated. What if nobody cared? But then I remembered all the years I stayed quiet because I was afraid of being judged. I wasn't going to hide anymore. I posted my favorite design with a short caption: "A small space can still feel alive." I didn't expect anything to happen, but by the next morning, dozens of people had liked it, and a few even asked for my advice. That small bit of recognition filled me with excitement. I couldn't stop smiling as I made breakfast. Mark noticed and asked what was so funny. I said nothing, but he kept staring, as if he didn't recognize me anymore. Later that day, I received a message from a cafe owner who had seen my post. They were remodeling and wanted help with ideas. I felt my pulse quicken. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but something told me to try. I agreed, not knowing this small decision would change everything that followed. I spent the next week sketching concepts for the cafe. Every design felt like a piece of my heart, colorful and hopeful. I sent them to the owner and waited, unsure if they'd like any of it. When they replied, their words made me cry. They said my designs were warm and refreshing, exactly what they wanted. I walked around the living room, holding my phone, smiling. Mark saw me and asked what was going on. I told him, and he laughed, saying people were just being polite. I didn't argue. I just kept smiling. As my project moved forward, Mark's attitude grew colder. He complained more often, picking at small things. If the house wasn't spotless, he called it lazy. If dinner was late, he sighed loudly. But I didn't let it get to me. Each complaint reminded me why I had to keep going. I realized his anger came from fear that I was changing, and he was right. I was changing. I wasn't the woman who waited for his approval anymore. I was the woman who finally remembered how to live for herself. One evening, while I was reviewing color palettes, Mark stood in the doorway and asked if I thought I was better than him now. His voice was sharp, defensive. I didn't answer. I simply looked at him, calm and silent. He muttered something under his breath and walked away. The truth was, I didn't feel better than him. I just felt awake. That scared him. People who depend on your weakness panic when they see your strength. I could feel his fear filling the house, but I refused to shrink myself to make him comfortable. A few nights later, I received a message from the cafe owner. They wanted to feature my design in a local article about small business renovations. I stared at the screen in disbelief. I had gone from forgotten housewife to being noticed for my talent. I saved the message, turned off my phone, and sat quietly. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was enough. I finally knew it myself, and that knowledge felt stronger than any apology Mark could ever give. When I told Mark about the article, he barely reacted. He muttered that I was probably wasting my time. I didn't argue, but something inside me hardened. That evening I found an old bus ticket from years ago in a drawer. I didn't remember where it was from, but I kept it. It felt like a small reminder that there were still places to go, still journeys waiting for me. I folded it neatly and placed it in my sketchbook, a quiet promise to myself that I wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. I started waking up earlier than usual, not for chores but for myself. I'd make coffee, open my sketchbook, and draw while the world was still quiet. Those mornings became sacred. They reminded me that my life could belong to me again. One day, as the sun rose, I realized I didn't miss the woman I used to be. I was her again, only wiser. If you're listening right now, take this as your sign. Never stop growing. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing who's walking this journey too. As weeks passed, I began receiving more messages from small clients asking for help decorating their homes or shops. I felt proud each time I saw someone value my ideas. Mark still didn't acknowledge it. He treated it like a distraction, something temporary. But I knew better. Every project gave me confidence, every client a reminder that I was capable. I even started saving the little money I earned in a jar, hidden in my closet. It wasn't much, but to me, it felt like freedom building up one coin at a time. My online following grew slowly. People began sharing my posts, saying my designs made them feel peaceful. The comments felt like a lifeline. I wasn't famous or rich, but I mattered to people who saw beauty in what I created. Mark noticed I was spending more time on my laptop and accused me of ignoring him. I told him I wasn't ignoring him. I was just finally listening to myself. He didn't know what to say, and his silence that night told me everything. He liked me quiet, not confident. That time was over. One weekend, I met a few women from my online group at a cafe. It was strange meeting people who saw me as an equal, not a background character. We laughed, shared stories, and took pictures. For the first time, I talked about myself without apologizing. I came home glowing, full of joy. Mark saw the change and asked if I was seeing someone. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it showed how little he understood me. I didn't need someone else to change me. I just needed to stop pretending I was fine. That night, I stayed up working on a new project, a small boutique that wanted a cozy redesign. I laid out color swatches, drew sketches, and felt alive. Mark stood behind me for a moment, watching, then he said it looked nice, and walked away. It was the first kind word he'd said in months, but I didn't take it as affection. I took it as awareness. He was starting to realize I wasn't just his quiet, predictable wife anymore. He didn't say it, but I could see it in his eyes. He was losing control. When I submitted the boutique project, the owner loved it and posted photos online, tagging me. The post got hundreds of likes. I felt proud but also nervous. Mark scrolled through his phone later and saw it. He asked why I didn't tell him it was public. I said I didn't think he cared. He said he cared about his privacy, not my little drawings. I turned away, done explaining myself. I realized his pride was louder than his love, and I was done trying to live small just to protect his ego. Each morning, I found new messages. People asking for tips, other women sharing how they'd started painting, sewing, designing again. My work wasn't just helping me, it was inspiring others. That thought filled me with quiet strength. Mark's attitude only worsened. He mocked me in small ways, calling me the internet decorator. I didn't react. I was learning that silence can be more powerful than argument. Every time I refused to rise to his bait, I grew stronger. Every time he tried to break my spirit, he proved why I needed to keep going. The tension between us reached a quiet breaking point. One morning, I told him I was moving some of my things into the guest room. He laughed, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. I needed space to think, to breathe, to exist. That night, I slept better than I had in years. The next morning, Mark acted as if nothing had changed, but it had. The house no longer belonged to him alone. I felt free within the same walls that once suffocated me. Freedom doesn't always start with leaving. Sometimes it starts with claiming your space. I began saving even more money from my work, keeping careful track. A part of me knew I was preparing for something bigger, even if I didn't say it aloud. One afternoon, I received an email from a boutique in another town. They loved my work and wanted to meet. My heart skipped. It wasn't just another project. It was a full-time position. I read the email twice, then 3 times. The decision would change everything. I stared at my phone, realizing the woman I had become would have to make a brave choice soon. That night, I sat outside on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The air was cool, the street quiet. I took out the old bus ticket from my sketchbook and held it between my fingers. It felt symbolic now, a reminder that there's always a way out, always another road. I didn't know where that bus once went, but I knew where I wanted mine to lead. I whispered a promise to myself. I would never go back to the version of me that begged to be seen. That woman was gone forever. The next morning, I looked around the house as if seeing it for the first time. Every corner told a story of who I had been: obedient, careful, scared. But I wasn't scared anymore. I brewed coffee, packed my sketchbook, and stepped outside into the morning light. I didn't tell Mark where I was going. I just knew it was the start of something new. My reflection in the car window looked different, strong, steady, awake. I wasn't running away. I was walking toward the life I should have been living all along. When I arrived in the nearby town for the meeting, I felt nervous but excited. The boutique owner, a woman named Claire, welcomed me with a warm smile. The space was small but full of character, and she said she wanted someone who could make it feel modern without losing its charm. I walked around, taking notes, visualizing textures, colors, and light. For the first time, someone trusted my vision. When I left, Claire told me she had a feeling about me. I smiled all the way home, knowing something in my life had finally shifted. Back home, Mark barely looked up when I told him about the meeting. He mumbled something about how people always make promises they don't keep. His voice carried that same tone of dismissal I'd heard 100 times. I didn't reply. I just went to my room and sketched out design ideas until midnight. The next morning, Claire emailed me to confirm the project. She even offered an advance payment. I stared at the message, smiling quietly. I wasn't imagining it anymore. My work mattered. Whether Mark saw it or not didn't change that truth. The days that followed were filled with movement. I started visiting suppliers, comparing materials, and creating sample layouts. My energy was different now. Even the way I walked felt new, confident, deliberate. Mark noticed. He started watching me more closely, suspicious but unsure why. I could feel his unease growing, and it didn't bother me. In fact, it fueled me. For years, I had shaped my life around his comfort. Now he had to live with mine. It was strange watching him realize that the woman he'd ignored was becoming someone he could no longer control. Mark's sarcasm turned into small jabs. He'd ask if I was playing decorator again, or if I'd joined a club for bored wives. The old me would have cried or defended herself, but I didn't. I just kept working. My silence frustrated him. He wanted a reaction. I understood something important then. Silence isn't weakness, it's power. I didn't need to argue to prove anything. Every sketch I finished, every task I completed, was a quiet answer to his insults. I was no longer asking for respect. I was earning it in my own way. One afternoon, while I was finishing a layout, I got a message from Claire asking if I could come in the next day. They were ahead of schedule and wanted my input before finalizing the new decor. I agreed without hesitation. Mark overheard and asked who I was meeting. When I told him, he frowned, pretending not to care. But that night, he stayed up late, pacing. He was starting to sense that the woman he used to control was slipping away. I didn't try to reassure him. I was done shrinking to calm his fears. The next morning, I left early, wearing a simple outfit that made me feel professional. I caught my reflection in the mirror before leaving. It had been years since I'd looked at myself with pride. At the boutique, Claire introduced me to a photographer who was covering their redesign story. They wanted to feature me as part of it. I didn't know what to say. My name, my face, my work, it was all going to be out there. As they took pictures, I felt alive. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was finally seen, and it felt real. When the feature was published online, I hesitated before showing anyone, but I didn't have to. People found it on their own. Messages began pouring in from friends I hadn't spoken to in years. They congratulated me, told me I looked happy, that I'd always had this talent. Reading their words made me tear up. For so long, I had felt unseen. Now the world was seeing me exactly as I wanted to be seen. It wasn't fame I wanted. It was acknowledgement. Just proof that I still existed as something more than a background character. Mark came home that evening holding his phone. He had seen the article. He asked why I hadn't told him. I said he didn't seem interested. He tried to act calm, but his voice cracked when he asked if I planned on doing this full time. I told him maybe. He didn't respond. He sat down on the couch, quiet, his pride bruised. Watching him shrink into silence felt strange. I didn't hate him, but I also didn't pity him. This was what it looked like when the balance finally shifted. I wasn't his anymore. Over the next few days, things between us grew even colder. We shared meals in silence, each pretending not to notice the other's distance. He started asking where I went, what time I'd be back, who I was meeting. I answered politely, but without emotion. I wasn't hiding anything. I was just done explaining my life to someone who had already stopped listening years ago. He wanted control. I wanted peace. The two couldn't live under the same roof anymore, and even though I hadn't said it out loud, I knew the truth clearly now. I started spending more time at the boutique, helping with finishing touches. Each day the space grew brighter and fuller, and so did I. Claire began talking about long-term collaboration. She said she needed someone dependable with taste and discipline. I smiled, thinking how strange it was to hear those words, qualities that Mark once mocked in me now being valued by someone else. Every time I stepped into that boutique, I felt myself heal a little more. I was building something that belonged entirely to me, and no one could take it away again. Mark tried a different approach after that. He began acting sweet, pretending to care about my projects. He asked if I needed help with photos or materials. But his kindness felt forced, almost rehearsed. I recognized it for what it was: fear. He was realizing that his words had consequences, and that losing me wasn't just possible anymore. It was happening. I didn't argue or confront him. I just kept moving forward. You can't rebuild a marriage when only one person wants to grow, and I was already too far ahead to turn back. That weekend, I was invited to a small networking event for local business owners. I went alone. The room was filled with energy and people who believed in their dreams. I listened, learned, and shared my story when asked. People admired my courage to start over, calling it inspiring. I felt humbled, almost shy, but proud. I wasn't pretending anymore. I was standing in my own life, fully present, driving home that night. The streetlights blurred through the windshield, and I thought about how strange it felt to finally belong to myself. When I walked into the house, the lights were off, except for the lamp in the living room. Mark was waiting. He asked if I had fun at my little party. His tone was light, but the edge in his voice was sharp. I said it was a work event and went to my room. He muttered something about me changing too much. I closed the door quietly. He was right. I had changed. What he didn't understand was that I was supposed to. The only thing unnatural was how long I had stayed the same. The next morning, I woke up early and made coffee. I watched the sunrise through the kitchen window. It was quiet, peaceful, calm. For years, I'd feared silence because it reminded me of loneliness. Now it felt like peace. I realized I didn't hate Mark. I had just outgrown him. That was harder to admit than any argument we'd ever had. Some people think love fades because of big betrayals, but sometimes it fades quietly, through years of being unseen. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just ready to move forward without him. That afternoon, I got a message from Claire asking if I could stop by. She wanted to show me something. When I arrived, she handed me a magazine. There I was, featured in a local lifestyle spread, Women Redefining Home Design. I stared at the page in disbelief. My name, my story, printed in ink. Claire said she was proud of me. I thanked her, holding back tears. For years, I'd waited for someone to say those words. Now I was hearing them, not from my husband, but from the universe reminding me that I mattered. Driving home, I replayed everything that had happened in the last few months. The exhaustion, the fear, the laughter returning, little by little. I realized that happiness didn't arrive with fireworks. It showed up in quiet moments, sipping coffee before dawn, sketching under candlelight, walking alone and not feeling lonely. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. I turned on the radio, singing softly along. My voice was rusty, but it felt good. I wasn't the same woman who used to cry into her pillow. I was free, and freedom felt warm. When I got home, Mark was sitting at the table, holding the magazine. He looked up slowly and asked if I was planning to leave him. I didn't answer right away. I just sat down across from him and met his eyes. He said he felt like I was slipping away. I told him that maybe I had already slipped. He didn't say anything after that. We sat in silence, both of us understanding that something had ended long before this moment. The only difference was, I was finally ready to admit it out loud. The next few days were strange. Mark became overly polite, asking how my projects were going, complimenting my work. It felt empty, like he was following a script. I responded kindly, but stayed distant. He was trying to fix something he had spent years breaking, but the glue was gone. My love for him had dried up quietly, like paint left open too long. I realized you can't repair what's been ignored for too long. You can only rebuild, and sometimes that means starting fresh, with no trace of the old structure left behind. One night, I sat on the floor of my room, surrounded by sketches. Each one told a part of my story, dreams revived, fears faced, courage found. I felt proud, but also a little scared. Success didn't erase the pain, it just gave it meaning. I knew big changes were coming, but I wasn't sure what they'd look like yet. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, promising myself that no matter what happened next, I would never go back to being small. That promise became the anchor I built my future on. Mark came home later than usual the next evening. He smelled like cologne and said he'd been meeting friends. I didn't ask for details. I didn't care anymore. He was free to do what he wanted, and so was I. The difference was, his freedom came from neglect. Mine came from growth. That night, I sat at my desk writing ideas for my own brand. Colors, name, style. It was just a list, but to me it felt like the blueprint of a new life. A life that didn't depend on anyone else's permission. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and stepped outside. The air was crisp, and the world was quiet. I thought about how fear had once kept me still. It wasn't the fear of failure, it was the fear of being alone. But standing there now, alone felt peaceful, not painful. I realized loneliness had been replaced by self-trust. When I walked back inside, the house didn't feel heavy anymore. It was just a building. My home wasn't these walls. It was the space I carried inside myself, the one I had finally reclaimed. A week later, I received another email from Claire. She said a boutique in another city had seen my work and wanted to offer me a full-time position. My hands shook as I read it. It felt unreal. I could start over completely. New place, new life, new version of me. I printed the email and placed it on my desk. Mark came in and asked what it was. I told him, and he laughed. saying I wouldn't last 2 months alone. I smiled quietly. He didn't know that I had already been alone for years. That night, I sat in bed, reading the offer again. The more I looked at it, the more I knew this was my chance. Everything I'd gone through led here. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew staying here meant going backward. I thought about the girl who once gave up her dreams for comfort, and I promised I wouldn't betray her again. I turned off the lamp and closed my eyes, imagining my new life waiting somewhere beyond this house, calling my name softly but clearly. I was almost ready to answer. The next day, I started making quiet preparations. I opened a new bank account, transferred my savings, and looked up apartments near the boutique. I didn't tell anyone. I wanted this to be mine, private and pure. Every small action felt powerful, like planting seeds in soil that had finally been cleared of weeds. I wasn't running away. I was walking toward something, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty for wanting more. I just felt ready. Sometimes, growth doesn't need a speech. It just needs one person brave enough to take the next step. That evening, I sat on the porch again, holding my old bus ticket between my fingers. The ink had faded, but I could still read the year, 1999. I wondered where that bus had gone, what destination I'd once planned. It didn't matter anymore. It had become a symbol, a reminder that my journey didn't end here. The sky turned orange as the sun dipped low, and I felt something inside me settle. I was done waiting for permission, done living half a life. Whatever came next, I was finally ready to move toward it. A few days later, I received the official contract for the new position. The paper felt heavy in my hands, not because of fear but because of meaning. It represented everything I had lost and found again. I read every line carefully, my heart steady. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a doorway out of the life that had once kept me small. I signed it slowly, taking a moment to look around the room. I realized I wasn't leaving home. I was taking my real home, myself, somewhere new. I waited until that evening to tell Mark. He was watching television, half focused on a game. I sat down across from him and said I'd accepted a job in another city. He laughed at first, thinking I was joking. When I showed him the signed contract, his smile disappeared. He said I couldn't just leave, that we were married. I told him marriage stopped being a partnership when one person stopped seeing the other. He stared at me, confused, maybe even scared. I didn't argue or cry. I just stood up and began planning my departure. That night, I started packing a few things quietly: clothes, sketchbooks, my laptop. I wasn't running away in the middle of the night. I was simply preparing for peace. Each item I folded felt like a goodbye to a version of myself that had tried so hard to be enough for him. I kept hearing his words in my head. Just a boring housewife. They no longer hurt. They reminded me why I had to go. I wasn't leaving out of anger anymore. I was leaving out of love for the person I had almost forgotten to be. The next morning, Mark acted as if nothing had happened. He made coffee, read the newspaper, and talked about bills. I listened, but said little. I wasn't trying to convince him of anything. My decision wasn't a debate. It was a fact. When he realized I wasn't reacting, his voice grew sharper. He said I was being dramatic, that I'd regret it. I simply nodded. I didn't need to prove him wrong. My life would do that for me. I walked into my room, closed the door, and continued packing in calm silence. When the weekend came, I finalized my arrangements. I found a small apartment near my new job and scheduled the moving truck. Each step felt lighter than the last. Mark still didn't believe I'd go through with it. He thought I'd get scared and stay. But fear wasn't in control anymore. Freedom was. As I taped the final box shut, I realized how much lighter my life had become when I started letting go of things that no longer served me. This wasn't loss. It was transformation, and I was finally ready to live it. The morning of my departure, I woke before dawn. The sky was pale blue, and the air felt fresh. I stood in the doorway of my room, looking around one last time. The walls that once felt like protection now looked like boundaries. Mark was still asleep on the couch. I wrote him a short note, not out of bitterness, but closure. I thanked him for the years we shared and left the keys on the counter. Then I picked up my suitcase, walked outside, and closed the door behind me without looking back. As the taxi pulled away, I felt a strange calm. I expected sadness, but there was only peace. The neighborhood passed by slowly through the window. The same streets I had walked 100 times, now fading behind me. The driver asked where I was headed. I told him the city name and smiled. It felt good to have an answer that was truly mine. The bus ticket I'd kept for years rested in my purse. It wasn't from this trip, but I held it anyway. It had always been waiting for this moment. When I arrived in the new city, everything felt different, busier, louder, alive. I checked into a small rented room for the first week and unpacked my essentials. The city lights glowed outside the window like distant promises. I sat on the bed, tired but fulfilled. I wasn't sure how I'd adjust, or if I'd make friends, but I wasn't scared, I was proud. Change didn't feel heavy anymore, it felt necessary. That night, I slept deeply, knowing I'd made the bravest choice of my life, choosing myself without asking permission. My first day at the boutique was exciting. Claire introduced me to the team, a mix of designers, decorators, and clients. The space buzzed with creativity, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to have me there. I was nervous but eager to learn. The work was demanding, but it filled me with energy instead of exhaustion. At lunch, Claire said she admired my courage for starting over. I smiled, thinking about how far I'd come. I wasn't just rebuilding a career, I was rebuilding my sense of worth, one design and one decision at a time. The following weeks passed quickly. I learned new techniques, worked on real projects, and began earning steady income. I rented a small apartment nearby. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. I decorated it with soft colors, warm light, and plants near the window. Every corner reflected me, not someone else's preferences. Each night when I came home, I felt proud instead of drained. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful. I had learned to enjoy my own company, and that, more than anything, felt like real success. Occasionally, I'd catch myself wondering what Mark was doing. Not out of longing, but curiosity. I imagined him still sitting on that couch, complaining about the world while it moved on without him. I didn't wish him harm. I just hoped he'd learn something from losing me. People often realize the value of what they had too late. For me, it was the opposite. I realized my value just in time. I wasn't angry at him anymore. He had been the lesson I needed to remember what I was capable of becoming. At work, Claire encouraged me to submit one of my designs for a regional showcase. I hesitated at first, afraid I wasn't ready, but she believed in me, and I realized I should too. I submitted the design, a cozy modern living room with natural tones and vintage accents. A few weeks later, I got the news. It was selected. The entire office clapped for me. I stood there stunned, tears in my eyes. It felt surreal. I wasn't just rebuilding, I was thriving. The woman I'd once been would never have believed this possible. That evening, I walked home through light rain. The street smelled like wet asphalt, the same scent that used to make me nostalgic. Now, it felt different. It reminded me that storms could wash away the old and make space for something fresh. I tilted my face up, letting the drizzle touch my skin. I thought about how much fear used to control me. Fear of leaving, failing, being alone. But fear had lost its power. I wasn't chasing happiness anymore. I was living it, quietly, one small victory at a time. At home, I made tea and curled up near the window. I opened my sketchbook. The same one from years ago. Its pages were now full again. Drawings, ideas, color tests. Each page felt like a chapter of my transformation. I remembered the night I first found it buried in a drawer, how lost I'd been then. I smiled, realizing that sometimes all it takes to change your life is to pick up the thing you once loved and start again. That night, I added one more sketch, a room filled with light and open space. Weeks turned into months. My life took on a new rhythm: work, creativity, laughter, peace. I wasn't rushing to fix everything or please anyone. I was simply existing, and that was enough. One morning, I received an email from a magazine asking to feature me in my work. I reread it twice, barely believing it. Recognition felt nice, but it wasn't the best part. The best part was knowing that I had done it by staying true to myself. My story wasn't about revenge, it was about rediscovering a life that had always been waiting for me. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. Each page was a reflection of gratitude. I wrote about my new home, my new friends, and even the quiet mornings when I worked alone. I realized how healing it felt, to be honest with myself on paper. I wrote about Mark too, not with anger, but understanding. He had been lost in his own way, unable to see beyond his pride. I wasn't excusing him, just accepting what had been. Forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for my peace, and I finally felt it. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering. It was Mark. His voice sounded tired, defeated. He said he missed me. I listened quietly. He said he finally realized how much I had done for him, how much he had taken for granted. I thanked him for saying it, but my heart didn't race or ache. It stayed calm. I told him I was happy, and hoped he found his own happiness too. When I hung up, I felt lighter than I ever had before. That night, I sat on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker below. The sound of cars, the hum of life. It all felt like a song. I realized I didn't need anyone's validation anymore. I wasn't proving anything to Mark or to anyone else. I was just living in alignment with myself. The calm that filled me wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, like quiet waves against the shore. I had spent years waiting for someone to choose me, but in the end, I was the one who did, and that changed everything. The next morning, I brought flowers to my desk at work. A simple gesture, but meaningful. I used to wait for someone else to make small moments special. Now I created them myself. The scent filled the room, fresh and clean. Claire noticed and smiled, saying the flowers brightened the place. I laughed, saying maybe that's what I was learning to do, bring light wherever I went, even in small ways. She nodded and said she was lucky to have me on her team. For the first time, I fully believed her. As weeks passed, my design projects expanded. I was assigned to lead a small renovation team. It was my first leadership role, and it scared me at first, but I handled it with quiet confidence. I listened, guided, and inspired others the way I had once wished someone would do for me. Seeing the younger designers grow under my direction filled me with pride. I realized healing doesn't only come from moving on, it also comes from helping others find their voice. I wasn't just rebuilding my career, I was paying forward the courage I had found. One evening, after finishing a big project, I stopped by a small bakery near my apartment. I ordered a slice of cake, chocolate, the same kind I once threw away at home. I took a bite and smiled at the sweetness. It tasted different now. Back then, it was a symbol of what was broken. Now it felt like celebration. I wasn't sad for what I'd lost anymore. I was grateful for what I'd gained. Every bite reminded me that healing doesn't erase the past. It just teaches you to stop living inside it. Later that week, I walked past a bookstore window and saw a self-help title that caught my eye, something about rebuilding after heartbreak. I smiled at the irony. I didn't buy it. I didn't need a guide anymore. My story was its own proof that renewal was possible. I had become the person I once looked for in others, the one who could offer stability, love, and hope. That realization brought a quiet tear to my eye. I wasn't broken anymore. I was whole, finally, and everything ahead of me felt like open sky. Claire surprised me one morning by saying she was nominating me for a regional design award. My first instinct was disbelief. I told her I didn't think I was ready. She laughed and said I'd been ready for a long time. That simple faith moved me. It reminded me that true support doesn't come from people who hold you back. It comes from those who see your potential, even when you doubt it yourself. I accepted her nomination, not to prove anything, but because it felt like honoring every version of me that had survived to get here. As the award date approached, I thought a lot about how my life had changed. I remembered the quiet mornings, the tears, the loneliness, and how each had pushed me closer to freedom. I wasn't chasing revenge on Mark anymore. I was chasing peace, and I had finally caught it. The night before the ceremony, I stood by my window, looking out at the glowing city. I whispered a quiet thank you. Not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, for reminding me that starting over is not failure, it's proof of strength. The next evening, at the award event, I stood among other designers, all dressed elegantly and full of stories. When my name was announced as one of the winners, I froze for a second. Then I smiled and walked to the stage. The applause felt distant, but the emotion was real. I wasn't just receiving recognition, I was standing as proof that broken beginnings can lead to beautiful endings. I didn't think about Mark, or the pain, or the past. I just stood there, tall and certain, knowing that I had finally come home to myself. After the award night, I walked home feeling lighter than air. The city lights shimmered like tiny stars scattered across glass. I held the plaque in my hands and thought about how strange life was. The same woman who once cried in a dim kitchen now walked home celebrated and free. I didn't feel superior or triumphant. I just felt at peace. The applause wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that I finally saw myself clearly. I wasn't living in anyone's shadow anymore. I had built a life that reflected my strength and my truth. The following morning, I woke early, still smiling from the night before. I made coffee and looked out over the city, the steam rising gently against the window. I thought of how many mornings I'd spent cooking for someone else who never noticed. Now every cup I brewed was for me. It wasn't selfish, it was healing. I realized love isn't proven by sacrifice, it's proven by self-respect. Every small routine now carried meaning, not obligation. I didn't need grand gestures or promises. Peace, I discovered, lives in the quiet details we often overlook. At work, my coworkers greeted me with congratulations. Claire hugged me and said she knew I'd win. Her pride felt genuine. Later, she asked if I'd consider leading a mentorship program for women entering the design field. The idea filled me with warmth. I thought about how many women, like me, were told to stay small. Helping them rediscover themselves felt like purpose. I accepted immediately. That day I didn't just feel successful, I felt useful. I realized success without meaning is empty, but when it lifts others, it becomes something truly beautiful. That evening, I organized my workspace at home. I framed the award and placed it above my desk next to the old bus ticket. Two symbols from different lives, side by side. One was a reminder of who I used to be, the other showed how far I'd come. I smiled, thinking about how pain and progress can share the same shelf. Growth doesn't erase the past, it reframes it. I didn't hate the years I spent as a housewife anymore. They taught me what happens when you forget yourself, and what's possible when you remember. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected message. It was from Mark. He said he had seen the award post online and wanted to meet. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something in me said to go, not for closure, but confirmation. I agreed to meet at a quiet cafe near my workplace. As I walked there, I didn't feel nervous. I felt grounded. Whatever he said, it wouldn't shake me. I wasn't walking into an old story anymore. I was stepping in as the author of my own. When I arrived, he was already seated, looking smaller than I remembered. Time had softened him, but not in a gentle way. He looked tired, lonely. He said he was proud of me. I thanked him. He talked about how he'd been thinking about us, how he wished he had listened more. His voice broke once or twice, but I stayed calm. He wasn't the villain of my life anymore. He was just a man who made mistakes he couldn't undo. I didn't feel anger, only distance. The kind that comes when something truly ends. He asked if I would ever consider coming back. I looked down at my hands for a moment, thinking of everything they had built since leaving. I told him no. Not because I was bitter, but because I had outgrown that chapter. The woman he remembered didn't exist anymore. She had loved deeply, tried endlessly, and lost herself in the process. But she had also found strength, courage, and peace. He nodded slowly, realizing what I meant. Sometimes, goodbye isn't loud. It's quiet acceptance that life moves forward without both people in it. After he left, I sat at the cafe for a while, sipping tea. I looked around at the other tables, strangers talking, laughing, living. I felt connected to them in a strange way. Everyone carries a story, a loss, a lesson. Mine had just reached a different chapter. I pulled out my journal and wrote one simple line, Freedom isn't the absence of love, it's the presence of self. I underlined it twice. That was my truth. I folded the page and slipped it between my sketches, where it belonged, with the things that gave me life. Weeks passed peacefully. Work thrived, and my mentorship group began to grow. Women from different backgrounds joined, each carrying her own version of a quiet struggle. Listening to them reminded me how easy it is to disappear when you stop believing in yourself. I shared my story with them, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that change was possible. Watching them find confidence made me feel whole. Their progress became my joy. It was the kind of happiness that didn't shout. It simply glowed from the inside, steady and sincere. One afternoon, I received a message from Claire asking if I could meet her at the office. When I arrived, she told me about a new opportunity, a chance to lead the design branch in another region. It was a promotion, a big one. My first thought wasn't excitement, but gratitude. I realized every risk I had taken had led here. Every painful choice had carried purpose. I accepted, knowing it would mean another move, another beginning. But this time, I wasn't leaving something behind. I was moving forward with everything I'd gained intact. That night, I walked home through the city, lost in thought. The wind was cool, and the distant hum of traffic mixed with faint church bells. That sound brought back the night I first decided to change my life. Back then, I was scared. Now, I felt strong. Every struggle had turned into a stepping stone. The sound of those bells no longer signaled endings. It marked beginnings. I smiled softly, whispering a thank you to the wind. The journey that started with pain had quietly become one of peace. I began preparing for my next move. It felt different this time. The first time, I left to escape. This time, I was expanding. I packed carefully, smiling at old things I used to associate with sadness. Now, they were symbols of strength. The sketchbook, the bus ticket, the jar of imported jam, they all came with me. They were reminders of where I started and how far I'd come. I wasn't afraid of change anymore. I trusted it, because I had learned that every ending is just a disguised doorway waiting to be opened. Before leaving the city, I threw a small dinner for my colleagues and friends. We laughed, shared stories, and toasted to new beginnings. It wasn't about success. It was about connection. I realized I had built a family here, one made of encouragement instead of obligation. As we said our goodbyes, Claire hugged me tightly and whispered, "Keep shining, Laura." Her words stayed with me. I had spent years dimming my light for others. Now I knew the world didn't need my silence. It needed my spark. I promised myself I'd never dim it again. On my last night in that apartment, I sat by the window and watched the city lights one final time. I thought about the woman who first moved in, nervous, unsure, clinging to scraps of hope. That woman had evolved into someone unshakable. I felt gratitude for both versions of me, because one couldn't exist without the other. Growth, I realized, is rarely pretty. It's messy, painful, and uncertain, but it's also the most honest thing we can ever do for ourselves. I closed the curtains and smiled, ready to face the next sunrise. The next morning, I left the keys on the counter and carried my bags outside. The air smelled clean after a night of rain. I took a deep breath, feeling that familiar mix of nostalgia and hope. The cab driver loaded my things, and I looked back one last time. There was no sadness this time. Only gratitude. That small apartment had been my cocoon. It had given me space to heal, rebuild, and rediscover who I was. Now it was time to fly again, not as an escape, but as a continuation of my journey. The train ride to my new city was quiet. I watched the landscape shift through the window. Towns, fields, stations. Each passing mile felt like a soft reminder that life never stands still. I thought about how scared I used to be of change. Now it felt like home. I didn't know what awaited me in the next chapter, but I knew I'd meet it with open hands. I wasn't chasing perfection anymore. I was chasing presence. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. When I arrived, the new office team greeted me warmly. The space was modern and full of color. It already felt like the kind of place I'd dreamed of designing years ago. I set up my desk, placed my framed award beside my computer, and hung a small plant near the window. These little touches made it feel like mine. As I looked around, I realized I didn't just belong here, I deserved to be here. The shy housewife from before would have doubted it. But the woman I had become knew she'd earned every bit of it. As days passed, I settled into the new role easily. I led meetings, presented ideas, and managed teams with quiet confidence. People respected me, not because I demanded it, but because I had learned to respect myself. That change radiated through everything I did. Each successful project wasn't just a career win, it was a personal victory over years of being underestimated. I wasn't proving myself anymore. I was simply living as the woman I was always meant to be. That realization was more rewarding than any paycheck or praise could ever be. One afternoon, while reviewing blueprints, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. It was from Mark. Inside was a simple note. He thanked me for inspiring him to change. He said he'd started therapy and wanted to learn how to be a better person. I read it twice and smiled. People grow when they lose something real. I wished him peace, silently. Life had a strange way of teaching lessons to both sides of a story. His growth didn't make me sad. It made me proud that something good could still come from our pain. That evening, I took a walk near the waterfront. The setting sun painted the sky in soft orange and gold. The breeze was gentle, carrying the faint scent of salt and warmth. I stood there for a while, reflecting on how far I had come. Every scar, every disappointment had become part of the foundation holding me up now. I realized healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning how to live fully with everything you've survived. I closed my eyes and let the wind wash over me, feeling completely, beautifully alive. Back at home, I unpacked the few sentimental things I had carried with me. The jar of imported jam sat on the counter, almost empty now. I laughed quietly, remembering how long I had saved it for someday. I opened it, spread the last of it on toast, and ate it slowly. It tasted sweet, not because of the flavor, but because it symbolized something. Someday had finally arrived. I no longer postponed happiness. Every small joy was part of the life I was building right now, not a dream waiting for permission to exist. In the following weeks, I started writing again. Not just journaling, but short essays about rebuilding after heartbreak. Claire suggested publishing them online. I agreed, and the response was overwhelming. People wrote to me, sharing how my story gave them courage to start over. Reading their words filled me with quiet pride. I had turned pain into purpose. I had once been invisible in my own story. Now my story was helping others see themselves. That kind of healing felt bigger than any success I could ever imagine achieving on my own. I began receiving invitations to speak at small local events, community gatherings, women's circles, even college workshops. Standing on stage felt strange at first, but then comforting. I wasn't performing. I was sharing truth. I told them that life doesn't always break you to punish you. Sometimes, it breaks you open so you can rebuild stronger. I watched the faces in the audience nod, eyes glistening. Their understanding made me emotional. Every word I spoke came from experience. I wasn't preaching. I was simply living proof that even quiet people can rise again. After one of those events, a young woman approached me, holding tears in her eyes. She said my story gave her hope to leave a loveless relationship she had been trapped in. I hugged her, telling her that courage begins the moment you stop waiting for permission. She thanked me and walked away smiling. That night, I sat by my window and thought about how pain multiplies when it's shared, but so does healing. Maybe that was the purpose of my journey, to help others find the strength I fought so hard to reclaim. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked around my new apartment. The walls were decorated with soft lights and sketches framed neatly. I caught my reflection in the mirror. I didn't look younger or different. I looked whole. Everything I'd lost had brought me here to this moment of peace. The woman staring back wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. I turned off the lights, whispered goodnight to the quiet, and felt a warmth that only self-love can bring. My story wasn't ending. It was finally beginning exactly where it should. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight spilling across the floor. The air felt light, as if the world itself was breathing easier. I brewed coffee and stood by the window, thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. It wasn't luck that brought me here. It was every decision I made when I thought I had no strength left. I realized healing doesn't arrive all at once. It's built in quiet choices, one after another, until one day you wake up and realize you're free. That day had finally come for me. Later that week, I got an email from a national magazine asking to feature my designs. It felt surreal reading it. Knowing how far I'd come from the woman once called boring, I accepted, not out of pride, but gratitude. My story had become a reflection of every person who had been underestimated. I wanted people to see that reinvention isn't just possible, it's necessary. I smiled, remembering that first sketch I'd drawn at the kitchen table months ago. That single act of courage had been the spark that reignited my entire life. The photo shoot took place in my studio, surrounded by my favorite designs. The photographer asked me to pose beside my framed award. I laughed softly, realizing how strange it felt to be celebrated for simply being myself. During the interview, when they asked what motivated me, I said it was realizing that no one saves you, you save yourself. The words felt simple but true. The room grew quiet for a moment, and I could tell they understood. I wasn't talking about success. I was talking about rediscovery and how it changes everything. That evening, I sat on the balcony watching the sunset turn the sky into gold and violet. The city's noise below felt comforting, like the heartbeat of life itself. I thought about the version of me who used to wait for permission to be happy. She had no idea that her quiet rebellion would lead here. I whispered a thank you to her for not giving up when it would have been easier to stay small. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do isn't fighting others. It's choosing ourselves when no one else does. A few days later, the article was published. It went viral quickly, shared by people across social media. The comments flooded in, women from everywhere thanking me for sharing something real. They said they saw themselves in my story, that they finally believed it wasn't too late to start again. Reading their words made me emotional. I had once felt invisible, and now my story was helping others feel seen. That was the real reward. Not fame or attention, but knowing that my pain had become someone else's hope. That was worth everything. Claire called that night, excited about the response. She said my story had inspired an entire campaign about empowerment and new beginnings. She wanted me to help design it. I agreed without hesitation. It felt full circle. What started as one woman's attempt to reclaim her life was now becoming a movement to help others do the same. I sat in bed afterward, smiling through quiet tears. Life has a way of repaying courage. Not instantly, but perfectly, when you least expect it. This time, it had given me more than I ever dared to imagine. As months passed, work flourished. My team grew, and so did my peace. I still kept the little things that reminded me of where I started: the sketchbook, the bus ticket, the jam jar. They sat on a shelf in my studio, not as symbols of loss, but of rebirth. People often asked how I stayed grounded. I told them I never forgot the feeling of being unseen. It's what keeps me kind, humble, and grateful. Every success I had was built on the foundation of a woman who refused to disappear. I honored her every day. One afternoon, I received an unexpected package. Inside was a small card and a keychain shaped like a star. It was from Mark. The note said he had sold the old house and was moving somewhere quiet to start over. He wished me happiness and thanked me for showing him what strength looked like. I held the card for a while, feeling a strange mix of sadness and peace. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, it meant letting go of the weight. I placed the keychain on my desk, a quiet reminder that endings can still carry grace. That evening I met a few friends for dinner. We laughed over stories, sharing bits of our lives. When one of them asked how I stayed so calm, I smiled and said peace isn't found. It's built. You build it by choosing yourself over and over, no matter how much it scares you. They nodded, thoughtful. I looked around the table and felt genuine joy. I wasn't pretending to belong anymore. I truly did. Life wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and honesty, I realized, was the most beautiful form of freedom. When I returned home, the night was quiet. I lit a small candle on my windowsill and poured a glass of wine. The reflection of the flame flickered softly across the room. I thought about everything that had brought me here. The heartbreak, the courage, the long, lonely nights. Every piece had been necessary. I raised the glass slightly, not to anyone else, but to myself. I wasn't celebrating revenge or success. I was celebrating peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop chasing approval and start living by your own light. As the candle burned low, I opened my journal and wrote a letter to my younger self. I told her she was never boring, never invisible, never small. I told her she was powerful long before she believed it. Writing those words made me tear up. I realized I wasn't writing to the past anymore. I was writing from the future she had hoped for. I closed the journal gently, feeling a deep calm settle inside. Healing had come full circle. I no longer needed validation. I had finally become my own home. Months later, my designs were featured in a national magazine again, this time under a section titled Women Who Rebuilt Their Lives. Seeing my name there didn't make me feel famous. It made me feel fulfilled. Mark texted me congratulations. I thanked him sincerely. The story that began with pain had ended with peace for both of us. People change in their own time, and that was okay. I didn't need closure because I had already found it within myself. The past was no longer a wound. It was a foundation for everything beautiful that followed. I opened my own design studio that year. My name was painted across the front window in gold letters. Standing there on opening day, I felt a quiet pride I couldn't describe. Friends, colleagues, and even clients came to celebrate. I gave a short speech, not about success, but about rediscovery. I said life has a way of hiding your purpose until you're brave enough to look for it. Everyone clapped softly, smiling. I looked around at the faces that supported me and thought, this is what real love looks like. Not control, but celebration. After the guests left, I stayed behind alone in the studio. The soft evening light filtered through the glass, painting warm streaks across the floor. I walked around slowly, touching the tables, the fabrics, the colors I had chosen myself. Everything felt alive. I realized I wasn't just designing spaces anymore. I was designing a new life, one rooted in joy and independence. I sat down at my desk, glanced at the framed bus ticket beside my lamp, and smiled. That ticket had once meant escape. Now it meant freedom and the courage to begin again. A few weeks later, a young designer joined my team. She reminded me of myself years ago, quiet, eager, uncertain. One day she confided that she doubted she was good enough. I told her something simple. You already are. You just haven't seen it yet. She smiled through tears. Watching her reminded me of my own journey, of how belief can change everything. Guiding her felt like passing on the strength I once had to build alone. It made me realize how far I had come, and how important it was to lift others as I rose. On my first anniversary of opening the studio, I hosted a small gathering with my team. We shared food, laughter, and memories. Someone asked what my biggest lesson had been. I said it was learning that love without respect is just habit. The room fell quiet for a moment, then they nodded. We toasted to growth, to courage, and to second chances. As I looked around at all the faces smiling back at me, I realized that healing doesn't end when the pain fades. It ends when joy becomes your natural state again. That night, after everyone left, I locked the studio and stood outside. The sky was clear, stars scattered above like tiny pieces of possibility. I heard a faint bell from a nearby church tower. The sound carried through the cool air, familiar and comforting. It reminded me of the day everything changed, when I decided I was done living small. That same bell that once marked the end of one life now marked the celebration of another. I whispered softly into the night. I made it, and the world seemed to whisper back, yes, you did. The next morning, I returned to the studio early. Sunlight streamed in through the windows, painting everything gold. I walked through the rooms slowly, running my hand across the walls. Every inch of the space told a story of resilience. I placed a small vase of fresh flowers on my desk, just like I did on my first day. It was a ritual now, a reminder to start each day with beauty. I sat down, opened my sketchbook, and smiled. The first line I drew wasn't for work. It was for me, pure, simple, peaceful. As the weeks went on, the studio flourished. Clients came from other cities, drawn to the warmth and honesty in my designs. Reporters wrote about my story, calling it inspiring. I read those words humbly, knowing they didn't tell the full story. The real transformation wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet moments of choosing myself again and again, until it became second nature. Every compliment, every success, was proof that starting over doesn't erase your past. It builds on it, turning pain into purpose and purpose into peace. I decided to frame one of my earliest sketches, the one I drew the night after Mark called me boring. I placed it on the wall near the entrance. It wasn't my best work, but it was the most meaningful. It reminded me that courage often starts in the smallest moments, hidden beneath heartbreak. I wanted everyone who entered to see it, and remember that beginnings don't need to be perfect. They just need to be honest. That simple drawing had sparked a new life, and I would never let myself forget that truth. Sometimes, clients asked me if I ever regretted walking away from my old life. My answer was always the same. I didn't regret leaving. I regretted staying silent for so long. But even that had purpose. It taught me what silence costs. It taught me how precious your voice becomes once you find it again. I told them change isn't about destroying the past. It's about reclaiming your future. Every person deserves that chance, no matter how late it feels. Regret, I learned, fades when courage finally takes its place. Years later, my studio became known for its warmth and emotional designs. I often looked around and thought about how far I had come. Life didn't give me shortcuts. It gave me lessons. I used to think my story was about loss, but it wasn't. It was about rediscovery. I hadn't lost a husband. I had found myself. That realization never stopped feeling powerful. People often think transformation happens overnight, but it doesn't. It happens one quiet act of bravery at a time, until one day your life finally looks like it belongs to you. One afternoon, I visited my old town for a work project. As the car passed my former neighborhood, I saw the old house standing there, smaller than I remembered. Its windows were dark, the paint peeling. I didn't feel sadness, only peace. I had cried enough tears for that place. Now it was just another building in the world. I whispered a quiet goodbye. Not out of grief, but gratitude. That house had once been my cage, but it had also been my classroom. It taught me everything I needed to learn about freedom. As the car drove away, I caught my reflection in the window. My eyes looked steady, my smile soft. I thought about every version of myself that had carried me to this moment. The hopeful girl, the tired wife, the brave woman who finally walked away. They all existed within me still, guiding me forward. The world outside blurred as I leaned back in my seat. Somewhere in the distance, a faint bell rang again. I closed my eyes and smiled, knowing its sound would forever remind me of becoming whole. Now, when I look back, I don't see failure. I see a woman who was brave enough to start again. My husband once said I was just a boring housewife. Maybe I was, for a time. But now I'm a woman who turned her pain into purpose, her silence into strength, her endings into beginnings. My story isn't extraordinary. It's simply proof that anyone can rebuild if they believe they deserve to. I no longer wonder what losing me looks like. I live every day showing the world what finding myself became.